Today's discussion is on gender. Your discussion question for the day is how and when did you know if you were a boy or a girl? And how did you know? Most people, when they answer this question, probably say something along the lines of their genitalia. Sex, as far as genitalia, is not quite the same as gender, although in most cases they do overlap. I'm actually discussing with this more of your internal sense. How did you know, at least internally, that you were a boy or a girl? The discussion for today is going to do a lot of discussions about people who might not necessarily have matching external and internal parts, along with various other things, but that is going to be a focus. So here is the eternal question. Is gender a social construct or a biological one?
When I was a kid, I used to try to get my sister, an avid feminist at the time, to react to comments like, "In general, men are stronger than women." It would usually work, and my short-lived laugh turned into an hour-long argument. She always said that men are just socially conditioned to be stronger than women, and while I never argued against the fact that society pressures certain groups of people into doing certain things, for example men lifting weights, eating mouthfuls of whey protein, and injecting themselves with male hormones, I also would argue that the biology between men and women is different. Just look at our bodies for one. As much as I would love to have a set of fun bags on my chest to play with, it would just never happen without the injection of female hormones or plastic surgery. You see, one of the problems with the question of whether or not gender is socially constructed is that the people who answer it most passionately generally overlook the arguments on the opposing sides. When I was a kid, I used to try to get my sister, an avid feminist at the time, to react to comments like, "In general, men are stronger than women." It would usually work, and my short-lived laugh turned into an hour-long argument. She always said that men are just socially conditioned to be stronger than women, and while I never argued against the fact that society pressures certain groups of people into doing certain things, for example men lifting weights, eating mouthfuls of whey protein, and injecting themselves with male hormones, I also would argue that the biology between men and women is different. Just look at our bodies for one. As much as I would love to have a set of fun bags on my chest to play with, it would just never happen without the injection of female hormones or plastic surgery. You see, one of the problems with the question of whether or not gender is socially constructed is that the people who answer it most passionately generally overlook the arguments on the opposing sides. Feminists tend to disregard many biological factors, while naturists tend to overlook sociocultural factors. Hello everyone, Thought Monkey here. Today we're going to explore both sides of the argument of whether or not gender is a social construct and try to come up with some kind of conclusion. First, some history and background. Gender is a term that was created as a way to differentiate between biological sex, whether or not you have an Italian salami or a hoo-ha, versus the psychological, social, cultural, and behavioral characteristics associated with being female or male. In recent years, many social scientists have begun to believe that gender identity is not a stable and fixed trait. They argue that it is socially constructed and can vary over time. Some have even argued that there are more than two genders and have created additional classifications by using terms such as cisgender, transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, agender, etc. Anyways, the two competing ideas about whether gender is a social construct come from the familiar nature versus nurture debate. In other words, is it our environment that makes us who we are, or our biology? Those who say gender is a social construct often argue the following. Number one, there are differences in gender norms in different cultures. For example, there are subcultures in India that identify 3 genders, and in Chile, some believe that you must channel another gender to accomplish certain tasks. The list goes on. According to the academics Candace West and Don Zimmerman, gender is an emergent feature of social situations, both as an outcome of and a rationale for various social arrangements, and as a means of legitimating one of the most fundamental divisions of society. By the way, I looked up Candace West on RateMyProfessor.com and she only got 2.1 out of 5. Would you eat at a restaurant that got such a low Yelp score? I didn't think so. Old Don didn't do much better. Another argument on the nurture side of the debate is that language forms our reality. The words man and woman are simply words to describe certain phenomenon, but don't describe every option or experience of all people in our culture. Phrases like be a man or boys don't cry are used to pressure boys into conforming to traditional masculine gender roles, while run like a girl and other women-centered phrases pressures girls into behaving in a way that is considered traditionally feminine. Others say that gender is a feature of nature, not nurture. They say that being exposed to testosterone and estrogen will make the way we behave inherently different. For example, there are studies that show male babies and female babies behave differently given different stimulus. Male babies tend to stare longer at mechanical objects, while female babies tend to stare longer at faces, which may explain why women and men tend to find themselves in different career paths. Men often gravitate toward science and engineering, while women toward healthcare and education. Another argument is that the reason some women and men identify as a gender opposite of their sex is because sometimes nature has hiccups. For example, some female fetuses are exposed to large quantities of male hormones and develop something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a fancy term for a disease that may alter the sex organs of people. Also, there are members of the trans community that believe gender is biological. Some trans women have stated that while they were brought into this world as men, from the get-go they felt biologically that they were women and thus behaved as a woman. Their argument is that if gender was socially constructed, then as a boy who felt like a girl, they would have been socially pressured into feeling like and behaving like boys. However, despite being socially pressured into feeling like boys, these transgender women have always felt like women despite their sex being male. Another argument is based on a story of a boy named David Reamer, whose circumcision went horribly wrong. He was given sex reassignment surgery at 22 months old and was raised as a girl named Brenda. Brenda was given girl toys but always seemed to gravitate toward more traditionally boy toys. Eventually, as a teenager, she expressed suicidal thoughts to her parents, and her father told her what had happened. Despite the female hormones and socialized pressures to be a girl, Brenda identified as a male and changed her name back to David when she was 14 years old. Years later, David started treatment to reverse the reassignment given to him as a 22-month-old baby and married a woman. Unfortunately, years later, after battling with a failed marriage and depression, at 38 years old he killed himself. This shows that despite the social pressures on David of his parents and doctors to identify and behave as a girl, he still felt like a boy. Those who argue nature over nurture also say that men and women are inherently equal, but differ in biology. Their environment and society plays a part in how we behave, like how boys are given blue and girls given pink, but most research shows that biology is the reason there are major differences in how each gender behaves. Because of this, society follows biology, not the other way around. Women have less sexual partners because there have been more severe consequences for choosing the wrong mate, birth, and then at least 15 years of caretaking. Society then stigmatizes women who don't follow a biological norm because our brains are wired for 100,000 years ago, not for a society that has technology that allows us to practice safe sex, where choosing the wrong mate no longer bears the consequence of a life followed by years of caretaking. Finally, if there are differences in how each sex looks, there must be differences in how we behave. Males tend to have more muscle mass than women, probably due to the amount of testosterone that they have. The hormones in a man's body must have an effect on their brains and how they think, thus how they act. Similarly, the amount of estrogen in a woman's body must have an effect on a woman's brain, how they think and thus act. Of course, there are exceptions. Some women are going to have more muscle mass than some men, and some men will want to act more as a caretaker than some women. So now that you have heard the arguments on both sides, what is the...
I really like the concept of just being ale, but they had an awful lot of information, that's some good information in there, and even more stuff that they just didn't have time to cover in basically 7 minutes. But the issue with David, that is a very real issue. People are still, there's been some push away from assigning a sex with ambiguous genitalia or with botched circumcisions. But there's finally been a push away from trying to assign somebody, especially the opposite group. But now you also know why the intersex community is also particularly against any form of circumcision, and a lot of that came down to David. Before the whole David situation, especially once it blew up, and you can get several books on his case study, nobody really seemed to matter or to care. And now, if you've ever noticed, it's the intersex community that is very much anti even doing things for religious purposes, or even for health purposes, because of that concern that they may have an issue and may snip off too much. Although realistically, that's really, really hard to do. it's really it's really hard to do as much damage as what happened to poor David. Introduction to terminology. We've got sex and we've got gender. They are different things, although a lot of people misuse one or the other. Sex definitely has a biological aspect. You may think, go by your genitalia, and that's fine. That is one option of how you use sex. You can also look at your chromosomal sex. You can also look at your hormonal sex. In most people, those three things align. There are challenges. Sometimes, as they showed in one of those videos, sometimes something happens and things don't quite line up. There's several different types of intersex situations, like maybe the chromosome has XXY, or maybe XYY. That's a challenge in a different actual chromosomal sex. There are also cases where XX may get that wash of male hormone and may develop really as a male. There are also cases of XY people who you can't tell because they look completely biologically female. Sometimes they're only able to find out if they're having issues with maybe menstruation or issues getting pregnant. Sometimes it takes that long to learn. But there are lots and lots of different variations on that. Gender is, well, pretty much how you are identifying internally. Yeah, you also have stuff like gender identity as well as a gender expression. Those are actually technically two different subsections of gender. You can identify in a variety of different genders, which will kind of come up there, and you can also express yourself in a variety of different genders. Until Queer Eye for the Straight Guy came out, this concept of a metrosexual as a type of expression, that did not really, I mean, I'm sure it existed, but it didn't blow up. Most of people are too young to really remember that. But that technically is a little bit of a different gender expression. But there are a lot of other different options as well. Said we also have got gender roles, and that is those behaviors, attitudes, etc. that are usually designated as masculine or feminine in a particular culture. You can vary across these as well. So you see several people here, several young ladies, doing some type of, I'm assuming, construction or military or whatever they're doing. Traditionally, that would have been a male role, and they're doing this, and they're doing, I'm assuming, okay in it. At least they seem to be happy doing it. So, but these people would probably just a few years prior, assuming they realistically were doing these male roles, they might come off as being a tomboy or whatnot, which prior to a few years ago, I mean, I guess it's still sometimes used as an insult, although it is very rare. Used to in the 80s be a very, very bad insult, and before then it was even worse. But these behaviors that are designated as masculine and feminine in a culture, it's also important to realize that different cultures say different things. So traditionally, in American culture, let's look at clothing. Men would be wearing pants, women would be wearing dresses. And realistically, in the 50s, that's pretty much how it worked out. You very rarely saw things go in the opposite way there. That being said, there are other cultures where women wear the pants and men are wearing something that's more like a skirt. Reason being that the women could do their work easier in the pants without showing everybody their genitals or whatever. It was just much easier to do what they needed to do. So all of this is really cultural specific, and culture does change. Nowadays, most people are not going to think too much of a woman trying to do a little bit of construction or some engineering or some science, but or even play sports to some extent. I guess it depends on the sports, but most sports it's not going to be too unusual. It's because basically because these roles are changing. More of these terminologies. Gender identity is that psychological sense of being male or female or other or whatever you want to go for. Sexual orientation. A lot of people confuse this with gender identity. I'm not entirely sure why, and in fact, I've almost given up trying to figure out why. Orientation. That's who you want to go to bed with. It's that easy. It really is. So, but anytime somebody says, I'm really, I identify as male or whatever, a lot of people respond to, well, I don't care who you go to bed with. Well, it's really none of their business either, because they're not the same thing. They're not even saying anything about who they want to sleep with. It's just like, oh, I internally feel like I'm this, that, or the other. I've had some incredibly rude questions about this because people can't separate what a gender identity is versus an orientation. I really have not don't really understand. But some of your sexual orientations, you can do the gay, two men together. You can do lesbian, which I mean, kind of, you can fall that under gay too. Two ladies together, you can be bisexual and go for either one. You can do pansexual, which usually when I hear the definition of that one, it's basically bisexual plus being attracted to trans people. I've never really understood that one. You also have options like asexual, and I'm sure I'm missing several. But those are basically who you're attracted to. Gender continuum. Basically, people can identify anywhere along the continuum, or possibly above the continuum, below the continuum. There's a continuum in all sorts of different factors. You can bounce back and forth if you really want to do so. It can be a little complicated at times, and you may identify male or female on a variety of different characteristics too. So, for those who are old enough to remember the Butch versus Femme test from many years ago, I think it might still be around. You can actually go off, and it's designed actually for lesbians to decide which of like 9 different lesbian stereotypes they are or something like that. But it actually does a really good list of the gender continuum as it pertains to women. So they had like a few different androgyne options based on whether you were slightly more feminine or slightly more masculine, for example. It's actually kind of an interesting one there. So here's some more terms. Cisgender. Your gender matches your biological sex. That's what that one is. People will sometimes shorten this to cis, and quite frankly, that a lot of people think that this is some type of insult. It is not an insult. A lot of cisgender people have no problems calling transgender people trans or the trans or a whole bunch of other things that are much more insulting. Tranny is one of them. Like that one's actually insulting. Trans is not insulting. So I don't understand why people think cis is insulting. Probably because people think of themselves as the default. However, if you're in a transgender space, an LGBT space, if the majority of people are transgender, then we are the default. And this is just a way to say somebody who is not part of this particular group. An amazing amount of people get insulted by this. Transgender, somebody who whose gender doesn't match their biological sex. There's actually a this is actually really a really huge umbrella term. A lot of people can fit in that. You're looking at people like cross-dressers can fit in that, because they have at least a certain set of characteristics that means they're showing some transgender behavior, even though they may not necessarily identify that way. Still, we allow them to, if they want to claim to be under our banner, we don't really exclude. There is a whole bunch of other people in that criteria that, if they want to be part of the group, the transgender community, as a whole, just the transgender part, not necessarily the subsections, it's very, very wide in variety. And this also can be somebody who does do a lot of things that are outside what their normal gender would be. Tomboys, again, might show up and people might identify them as being transgender, because trans simply means you're doing something across what your normal side would be. You trans across. Cis is same. People who've taken chemistry, y'all will know this. So in transgender, they have a very small section of people who are actually transitioning, who became that distressed that they had to transition at some point. This is not a majority. It's actually a minority. One statistic I saw said, as far as actual transsexuals are concerned, you're looking at 1 in 100,000 people for going female to male. At least that's medical transition. There's some idea that this might be, that number might not be correct, but that's about as close as we're going to get right now, because it's hard for us to find out who's maybe socially living. But so we mostly have to go by the medical stuff. You don't necessarily have to transition medically. You can transition socially. And a lot of people who transition socially end up transitioning back. So there is that, and it does get kind of confusing at that point. But you can be a non-op transsexual. Maybe there's something going on that you can't transition. Maybe there's something going on that you can't hormonally transition. Let's say leukemia. I know a male to female who could never. There's a lot of things that she couldn't have done, really, because she had leukemia and she couldn't disrupt her body too much. Otherwise, it might reject the transplant that she had. Fair enough. But she did live as a woman for 20 years, detransitioned, and last I heard, now she's partially transitioning back. Very confused. She's like 80 years old at this point. No, 70 years old at this point. But transsexuals really are a minority. Everybody thinks that they're like everywhere. Transgender people might be everywhere. The transsexuals themselves are actually pretty rare. And if you are trans and trying to find somebody who is a doctor who's willing to even see you as a patient, regardless of anything, is pretty rare. I have to travel 3 hours to get to my doctor, for example. We also have stuff like genderqueer, gender non-binary. It's a very wide range of people who just don't identify with the gender binary or don't want to conform to it, do whatever they want to do. Gender fluid, your gender is literally changing. Sometimes you might feel male today or so female today. Both, neither, whatever. Might only activate in certain circumstances. That's another possibility as well. Agender, you don't have a gender or have a neutral gender. You're just kind of right there. And by gender, you identify as two genders. So a little bit more about transgender and non-binary people. Just some facts. Suicide attempt rate. Nearly 51% of female to male people have attempted suicide. And these are how many have attempted and survived. Of course, there's a lot of percentage of people that just didn't survive, It's kind of hard to say because maybe they didn't say why they were committing suicide. As far as non-binary, looking at about 42%, and almost 30% of male to female. In comparison, the normal rate for cisgender females, about 18%, and male about 10%. This is an absolute epidemic. I'm a 4-time suicide attempt survivor. So most of these people are will be attempting multiple times. Transgender people more likely to be unemployed. So normally our normal rate of unemployment is somewhere around 6 to 7% on average. Transgender non-binary, you're looking at 14 at a minimum. When the economy is bad, that goes way much higher than anybody else. If you're working, you're more likely to be underemployed. 44% of people are underemployed. Underemployed is defined as less than 36 hours a week. This is regardless of your degree or experience. More likely to be discriminated against in housing. Even if you already have a contract, you are more likely to be kicked out of your housing if they think that you're trans, and that is still occurring in multiple states of this country. I'm currently doing this in spring 2021 in the United States. Almost every state will still let you kick out, and even if they don't say that it's because of that, they can find another reason. More likely to be medically discriminated against. If you are lucky, you will have a few doctors in your state that will see you, despite the fact being trans or non-binary. There are only a handful of doctors in Georgia that will see people. We actually keep a list of people that, or we used to keep a list, I'm not on that list anymore because I found my doctors, where it actually says who you can go to for help. My neurologist is the only one on that list, and I was the person who put it on. Then there are only a handful of people, and they're all in Atlanta. As of right now, only 17 states plus DC provide any protection for transgender workers, or transgender students, really. They should be added that too. And so that means you can be discriminated against based on your gender identity, your gender expression, all those options. More likely to have your kids taken away by Child Protective Services if you have kids, because you're considered to be a non-fit parent. Currently, I dealt with that. I lost my kid for 10 years because of that. My only problem was that A, I was trans, and B, that I was Jewish, and I wouldn't let her celebrate Christmas because I'm Jewish. Mostly it was because of being trans. Medical insurance, you're less likely to cover your health costs, even if the costs have nothing to do with transition. And that's 100% true. Doctors will sometimes do what they can to hide things to get things to be covered, or to hide a name change, hide something like that, just so things can get covered. If, for example, therapy is very, very expensive. If your person labels you as being having some type of gender challenge, and maybe you're also in for depression, or maybe your therapist is just saying that they're in for depression or anxiety or whatever, and insurance finds out that you transitioned, they may retroactively turn down all the therapist's things, even if there is no mention of gender identity on that form. This is, by the way, why a lot of transgender people, even now, private pay for their psychologists. when they have to socially transition or medically transition, because you are required to there are little gatekeeper things that you have to do. For a while, it was you could have lived as a member of the opposite sex, and then, or you could have gone to therapy. And usually, a lot of people still want the therapy letter to say yes, this person's okay, because an awful lot of people with mental health problems try to use transition as a way to make things better, and this can actually make things a hell of a lot worse. So you actually have to have a minimal amount of psychological issues that are likely to be improved by transitioning. Here's your joke. How many trans people does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but people will always ask you if your light bulb's had, the change. And really, people love asking about that type of thing. Some people won't be so blatant as to say that. Some people will instead say, how do you like to have sex instead? And that's a sneaky way of asking what your bottom looks like. So gender differences. There are gender differences due to, well, actual gender and sex differences. Males are going to tend to be taller. That's just sexual dimorphism. Although even if I was given all the hormones at a younger age, I probably wouldn't have gotten very tall. My dad's not very tall. So there are gender differences due to that. And men will tend to have more muscle. You can build some of that up if you take testosterone. Gender roles, we've got, of course, different socialization that it all relates to this. We are all socialized differently to act differently. And I mean, that's just part of our culture. Stereotypes, everybody is very familiar with stereotypes, and some of those stereotypes also fall into the attitudes and the gender roles. People say, oh, women can't do X, Y, or Z. Well, usually women can do X, Y, or Z. Or they say men can't do X, Y, or Z. Most of the time, men can, in fact, do X, Y, or Z. And the stereotypes that we have about men or women or whatever, a lot of that does, again, come up to be cultural. It's not completely cultural, but there are an awful lot of things in there. We also might take these roles and stereotypes and try to enhance that part of our body or our mind. So our body as well. So if you're in a situation where there's a gender stereotype of the men being like really, really aggressive, you may tend to pick that up, whether you're a male trying to become more aggressive because that's being influenced, or if you're a female who might think that they're a male, you may end up being more aggressive as well. That's just an example. So look at other gender differences. A lot of people say that men have way better self-esteem than women. And this is a chart here. Standardized self-esteem chart. Now, if here's the number of people and your standardized self-esteem score, I don't know what they used as far as what test or anything else. But yeah, you can see that women are, the females are slightly below, but it's very, very slight. And in fact, all of this is not even statistically significant because things are just so close. So realistically, that whole concept, that idea of men having better self-esteem than women, you're looking at the individual at that point. Some might and some might not. An awful lot of women are doing an awful lot better than the men. So if here's the women, look at that crossover. So we get to play true or false. True or false? Boys are more active than girls. The answer is false. Boys are really not much more active than girls. It's not statistically significant. Boys show better spatial abilities than girls. True or false? It's actually mostly false. A lot of this comes down to socialization. While initially boys are slightly ahead when they're very young, women, when given the opportunity to catch up very, very quickly and usually match the boys. Sometimes they even exceed the boys. But all of this comes down to girls not being given the opportunity to practice. Girls are more fearful, shy, or scared of new things than boys. True or false? The answer is false. When girls being fearful really depends on different cultures that they're in. A lot of cultures, girls are not more fearful or shy of new things. It's not even different. Or sometimes it's the boys that are kind of more frightened. If we want to look at politics and such, women will tend to be more likely to at least consider that new thing than a lot of the men are. Boys are angrier than girls. The answer is false. In this particular culture, the U.S. American culture, boys are encouraged to express their anger more than girls. However, when you look at internally, boys and girls are both similar. And that's what it comes down to. There's no statistically significant difference. Girls are more emotional than boys. Again, the answer is that it's false and that there's no statistically significant difference. Boys perform better at math than girls. True or false? False. Women actually do better than men at a younger age. Unfortunately, due to societal pressures, women are less likely to be in math classes, are less likely to be encouraged to perform math, so thus the boys will tend to get better overall. However, for most of the elementary and middle school years, going into early high school, women are usually doing better. Girls are more talkative than boys. True or false? False. The boys can talk up a storm just as much as the girls can. We tend to learn about gender from a pretty young age. By 1 year old, most kids can distinguish faces by gender. By 2, you can usually label other people's gender and can sort objects into gender categories. For example, if things are, for girls, things are boys, for example. By 3 or 4 or so, they can identify what they say their gender is. So if you ever ask a lot of trans people, most people will state that they knew by the age of about 3 or 4 years old. I certainly knew when I was 3 or 4. I said something to my mother because people kept saying I was a little girl, and I said, well, why do you tell them that? I'm a little boy. And I woke up basically unconscious. I had been knocked unconscious because people were very, very anti that. But that 3-year-old can probably identify what gender they are. Now, they still have got some ability to alter, but most people know. And even if they do say it's one gender, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're going to grow up to be. But an awful lot of people do know at a fairly young age. And this is also the time they think the sex, as in penis or whatever, is determined by something else out there. It's not unheard of for people to wish for, a sex change at that point, and that's what they ask for Christmas or whatever, because this is consistent with that. When you get a little bit older, 3 to 6, so young elementary school, learning a little bit more about consistency with gender, and you may start to develop a very, very strong ideas about what each gender tends to do and how they tend to act, that whole stereotype. But when you get a few years later, 8 to 9, they are a little bit more flexible in those stereotypes. So there are a lot of theories that go about gender, and one of them is this developmental intergroup theory, which basically says that adults are overly concerned with gender and sex. And you do in fact see this a lot at least in this culture. You don't see this necessarily in others, but this theory suggests that everybody is being so obsessed with gender and sex from a very, very young age, encourages kids to make gender be very, very important and a key source of info about themselves and others and how they should act or not, how they should be treating other people, for example. To really be obsessive over the differences between the two genders. Women and men are, for the most part, more alike than they are different. And by overly expressing so much about the gender differences, this can cause more trouble down the line, because people really, really make a big deal about these differences, even if it's something very, very small. They make it much bigger than it would be or should be. Encourages rigid stereotypes, saying, women can't do this, women can't do that, women shouldn't be involved in science or whatever. Oh, just for that reason. Or men can't deal with kids because they're men. Women are just as capable of doing science. Men are just as capable as doing, education, healthcare, etc. Here's another one, gender schema, which basically says that children are just organizing everything into categories, which are known as schema. Schemas are things that pop up. It should have been popped up in learning, although it really isn't mentioned in the book I'm currently using. So I may have to go back and deal with that at some point. But it's basically saying everybody's grouping into categories. So we got 3 people here, and we've got at least two women, and I think this person in the middle I'm not sure if this person is male identifying, trans, or non-binary. I can't really tell. Definitely can tell the other 2 are more feminine appearing ladies, and obviously you can see that they all are firefighters. Traditionally, that would not be in a female role, or would be in neither role. It would be traditionally a male role. But in this whole gender schema thing, is they take everything and just dividing up into categories, and they build everything around this schema of what is a woman, what is a man, what they can and cannot do, based on this. There's also social learning theory, which we touched upon in a few other lectures that we have. If you remember the guy that had the Bobo doll, Bandura, basically saying that we're all learning by watching what other people are doing. Same concept here. So gender roles are learned through reinforcement, punishment, and modeling. This little kid, who is so adorable, I'm guessing that's Daddy in the background, he's just mimicking what Daddy is doing. He doesn't have any muscles. He doesn't have anything. He's like 3 years old, maybe 4 years old. I mean, he's a baby. He's got nothing. He's got nothing going on here. Daddy has got some stuff going on. it's highly likely that when he grows up, he's probably going to start working out like dad, because he has that as a role model, and he's probably going to end up being somewhat similar to his dad in the back, and this all starts at a pretty young age. Now, there are different genders that occur in different cultures. Here is a sample of one of those groups. This is out of India, and there are other genders in different cultures as well. Not every culture has just two.
The Hijra are a unique group of people in India who don't identify as male or female. They've been a significant part of Indian culture for more than 4,000 years. Ancient myths and legends surround the Hijra's ability to bring luck and fertility, yet despite their history, the Hijra still face heavy discrimination. The Hijra are a unique group of people in India who don't identify as male or female. They've been a significant part of Indian culture for more than 4,000 years. Ancient myths and legends surround the Hijra's ability to bring luck and fertility, yet despite their history, the Hijra still face heavy discrimination. Today, around 1 million people identify as Hijra in India. People like Meena.
मैं 55 साल 35 साल से गुरु बने बैठे, जैसे मैं बाहर निकलती हूँ, बुजुर्ग लोग हैं, बुढ़े लोग हैं, ओवरेज वो भी पैर छुएंगे, गुरुजी।
While Guruji is a term of respect, the social status of Hijra in Indian culture is complex. Many face violence and discrimination on a daily basis. Doctors refuse to treat them, police arrest them, and finding mainstream employment is virtually impossible, which is why Hijra like Meena have traditionally traded on their mythical ability to bestow fertility on newlywed couples hoping to conceive.
बच्चा होता है, उसके बच्चे होने पे जाते हैं हम लोग, बच्चे होने पे जाते हैं, बच्चे की बधाई देते हैं, डांस करते हैं, तो मैं उनको आशीर्वाद दूंगी, मोहर भी दूंगी, भगवान अच्छा रखे, खुश रखे, ज़्यादा खुश रखे, भगवान तुम्हारी तरक्की दे, ये दे, वो दे, और भगवान तुम्हें पोता हो, बेटा हो.
With no other opportunities for employment, being paid to dance and bestow blessings is appealing to many young transgender people. However, the decision to become a Hijra is not one to be taken lightly. Many are forced to undergo a castration ritual to honour the fertility goddess Bahuchara Mata, whom the Hijra worship. And there's also the very real chance that your family and friends will disown you.
लेकिन बचपन में मेरा बहन का सूट पहनती थी, जीन्स टॉप पहनती थी, शुरू से मैं ऐसा हूँ. लेकिन घर वाले चाहता नहीं जो मैं हिजरत से साथ आ जाऊँ, डांस करूँ, वो लोग नहीं चाहता है. लेकिन हम फिर भी आ गए अपना मर्जी से, क्यों? अपना स्वाधीनता पाने के लिए.
That's Anka, one of many young Hijras in New Delhi. Being shunned by family members and society in general is all too common, and so many find solace in the Hijra community. But within that community, there's a hierarchy, and younger members are often discouraged from becoming gurus until they're older.
इधर में मेरा जो कुछ भी मैं अपना स्वाधीनता, मतलब कभी उधर जाने पाऊंगी, कभी उधर जाने पाऊंगी, अपना मर्जी से डांस करने पाऊंगी, उधर जाने पाऊंगी. ऐसा वो लोग अपना मर्जी से, वो लोग बुढ़े हो गया, तुम लोग अभी भी जुआ नहीं है, तुम लोग अपना मर्जी से वो करके करो, बस कुछ भी करके करो, सेक्स करो, डांस करो, वो करके कमा लो पैसा, तुम लोग को मर्जी से. हम लोग को साथ माता हो, हम लोग को लेता भी नहीं वो लोग.
What's strange is that it wasn't always this way. For thousands of years, the Hijra were revered in India. Many were charged with keeping the virtue of harems. Others were landowners, and some even employed as royal advisors. This all changed when the British came to power in India. British colonizers were disgusted by the Hijra, and in 1897 a law was passed that classified the Hijra as criminals. Since then, they have been outcasts, which means for people like Anka, employment options are almost non-existent.
कोई अच्छा कंपनी में जॉब करना चाहती हूँ तो बोलते नहीं, तुम लोग किन्नर हो, तुम लोग को नहीं जॉब मिलेगी, हैं? तो बोला हम लोग बोलती हो प्लीज़ जब में ले लो, तो ले लेते नहीं तो क्या करूँगी. तो हम लोग नाचा गाना, जो अपना कोई लाल बत्ती मांगते हैं, कोई डांस करते हैं, जो चीज़ करके कमा लेती है.
When the Supreme Court of India ruled that Hijra should be legally recognised as a third gender in 2014, many thought that the ruling was a measure of the public's acceptance and that employers would finally be open to hiring transgender workers. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the case. The majority of Hijra remain unemployed. Campaigners are fighting to stop the discrimination, but acceptance may never be what it once was before British rule.
बोला ये मान लेती हुई इजराइल को साथ जो नौकरी दिलाएगा वो देगा ये देगा, लेकिन नौकरी जब तक देगा तब तो लग रहा है आगे क्या होगा नहीं होगा वो तो हम.
And of course, not only does that have to do with stuff that's going on in India, that also is occurring in other cultures. They mentioned Venezuela. We're not watching the Venezuelan one. This type of Mexico also has a third gender. And for those who are monotheistic, the original monotheistic religion, Judaism, actually has 6 different genders in their holy works, specifically in their Talmud. You also see additional genders in Japan and a few other places as well. Usually you'll only see one additional outside of the 2 genders, but some places they do have many more. It's just more common to have a third gender, and it's usually some male to female, and I'm not quite sure why, but I did want to at least introduce the fact that there are different genders in different cultures. So now let's get to talk about the various discrimination. And there is a lot of discrimination. Not only, certainly there's a lot of stuff against the transgender community there, but in gender in general, there's a lot of discrimination. For people who think that men can't be teachers, that's also gender discrimination because you're discriminating against men. People saying women can't do science, that's discriminating against women. Choosing only to go one or the other. For example, there is a lot of discussion about whether female patients asking to only see female doctors is also a form of discrimination. So people are really doing this because maybe they did have a bad experience, but that doesn't give you the right to discriminate any more than it gives the right for some people to discriminate against race. Because if that had happened, well, things would be a lot different if people were able to discriminate. Oh, I had a bad experience with a white person, I'll never deal with white people again. I had a bad experience with a black person, I'll never deal with any black people again. There is really no difference between this and gender discrimination, even for something like that. So there's also this concept of sexual harassment, unwanted treatment relating to behaviors or appearance. It's usually women who are the victims of this. Men can certainly be the victims of this. Transgender women are probably the ones who get the most sexual harassment. I know cisgender women think that they have it bad, and they do, but transgender women are getting it from pretty much all sides as well. You can also sexually harass a gay man, and people do that. Usually, if people are being discriminated against as far as the transgender situation, that gender discrimination, or getting sexually harassed, and they are members of the LGBT community, they're not going to be taken seriously. And that's because nobody basically cares about the community, or they believe that there's something else going on, or there's always a concept of stereotyping as well, such as people think that men can't be raped. Oh, I assure you, yes, they can. Men can certainly be harassed, but it's just a question of, who is basically filing that charge, who is doing it. Sexual harassment, women to men, occurs more often than a lot of people think. And like I said, certainly the trans community is getting all of this, and it is really, really bad, and people think that they can get away with it. So I would suggest anytime you see some type of gender discrimination, even if it's, unless it's something like, women having a women-only space, when most things have both, that might not necessarily be gender discrimination if that's their private rule. But generally, in a public situation, that's not going to be acceptable, especially if it's designed specifically for that group. I would still recommend you saying anything if you see something suspicious like that. If you are seeing any type of sexual harassment, whether it's towards you, towards towards a guy, towards a girl, towards towards a transgender person, you need to help report that, because otherwise things are just going to get worse. A lot of times, the gender discrimination and sexual harassment can frequently lead to murder, quite frankly, especially towards the LGBT community. This is often how one or both of these things start. So here are a few discussion questions. When have you experienced or witnessed gender stereotypes affecting a gender role? How might adults influence children's behavior around gender roles and stereotypes? And when have you witnessed this influence? And here is a freebie, which if you're in person with me, you can just ask me this one when I'm doing this lecture. You have an opportunity to ask a transgender person one non-offensive question. What is it? Of course, if you have any questions regarding any of this, you can feel free to send me a message, drop me an email, or whatever you need to do. Thank you. Have a great day.